By 1943, German infantry commanders on multiple fronts were filing the same confused report up the chain of command. American rifle squads, they wrote, appeared to be equipped with an unusually high number of light machine guns. They weren't. Every man they were facing simply had a rifle that fired as fast as he could pull the trigger. The Germans had nothing like it, had no answer for it, and spent the rest of the war desperately trying to build one. They never got there. That rifle was the M1 Garand, or Garand, if you want to spend the rest of the day arguing in the comments. The man who designed it pronounced his name Garand rhymes with errand, and that's what we're going with. To understand how this rifle came to exist, you have to go back to 1918. When the First World War ended, the US Army looked at what 4 years of industrial combat had actually taught them. Machine guns and artillery had dominated the battlefield. The individual soldier, armed with his bolt-action Springfield M1903, could only fire as fast as his hands could work the bolt between shots. Every other army on Earth was in the exact same position. The army wanted something better, a rifle that gave individual soldiers sustained firepower without the weight or complexity of a machine gun. The official search for a semi-automatic service rifle began in 1919. The concept wasn't new. Winchester and Remington had been selling semi-automatic hunting rifles since 1905. The problem was the cartridge. The Army was deeply committed to the .30-06 Springfield round, effective beyond 1,000 yards, proven in combat, and stockpiled in enormous quantities left over from the war. But .30-06 generated enormous chamber pressure and needed a long, heavy cartridge case. Every attempt to build a self-loading action tough enough to handle that pressure reliably ended up too heavy, too fragile, or too complicated for field use. Through the early 1920s, trial after trial produced the same result. The problem sat unsolved for years. That changed when John Cantius Garand arrived at Springfield Armory in November 1919. He was a Canadian-born machinist who had left school at 11, worked his way up from a textile mill floor, and spent his spare time designing firearms as a hobby. He wasn't a formally trained engineer. He was a man who understood machines the way some people understand language, intuitively and completely. He was a civil servant earning a modest government salary and would never receive a single dollar in royalties for everything he was about to build. His breakthrough was a gas-operated system. When a cartridge fires, it produces propellant gases. Garand tapped a small portion of those gases through a port beneath the barrel, driving a piston that cycled the bolt automatically, ejecting the spent case and chambering the next round using the rifle's own energy. It finally made reliable semi-automatic operation possible with a full-power military cartridge. By the early 1930s, his designs were consistently outperforming every competitor in Army trials. Then the Army threw him a curveball. The High Command was seriously considering abandoning the .30-06 entirely in favor of a lighter cartridge called the .276 Pedersen, which made semi-automatic engineering significantly easier. In 1930, a .276 Garand actually won formal recommendations for adoption. Then, the generals killed it. The Depression-era War Department wasn't willing to fund an entirely new ammunition supply chain when they were sitting on mountains of .30-06 left over from 1918. Garand went back to his workshop and started over. He solved it. On January 9, 1936, the US rifle caliber .30 M1 was formally adopted, the first semi-automatic rifle standardized as the primary service arm by any major military power in history. Before we get to the fighting, the mechanism deserves a straight explanation because the myths around it are significant. The M1 feeds from an EN block clip, a stamped steel bracket holding 8 rounds in a stack. You lock the bolt open, press the loaded clip into the receiver until it clicks, release the bolt, and the rifle is ready. Every trigger pull fires a round and automatically chambers the next. No bolt handle, no interrupted sight picture, no breaking your grip between shots. When the last round fires, the empty clip ejects upward out of the receiver with that unmistakable metallic ping, and the bolt locks open. That ping has a mythology far out of proportion to reality. The story goes that it warned enemy soldiers the rifle was empty, giving them a moment to rush the shooter. Think about what that actually requires. A lone soldier at close enough range that a small metallic sound could be heard over gunfire and explosions, facing an enemy who recognizes it and acts faster than he can reload, while every other American in the squad keeps firing throughout. Veterans consistently said the ping was inaudible beyond a few feet in any real firefight. The myth survived because it is simply a better story than the truth. What did earn a genuine reputation was the Garand thumb. The bolt snaps forward with real force when loading. Put your thumb in the wrong position and it will find you. It was not a combat problem, it was a training range problem, and soldiers learned the correct technique quickly or they learned it painfully. There was also a real tactical limitation worth mentioning. You could not top off a partially spent clip. Fire 4 rounds, take cover, and your choices were to eject the remaining rounds and lose them, or fire them off and waste ammunition. Neither was ideal. But after soldiers used the M1 in actual combat, nobody wanted to go back to a bolt action regardless. Now, if your image of the German soldier comes from film and video games, you picture him carrying an MP-40 or the STG-44 assault rifle. Those weapons were real and genuinely advanced. But the production numbers tell a very different story. Germany produced approximately 1.1 million MP-40s across the entire war, and roughly 430,000 STG-44s. The Kar 98K bolt-action Mauser, the rifle the average German soldier actually carried, put over 14 million units into service between 1934 and 1945. The typical German infantryman in 1943 was carrying essentially the same weapon his father had carried in 1916. This was not a failure of engineering. German squad tactics were built around a completely different philosophy. The MG-34 and later the MG-42 machine gun was the centerpiece of their infantry doctrine, the primary source of firepower around which everything else was organized. Bolt-action riflemen existed to protect it, feed it, and move it forward. The Allies used automatic weapons to support their riflemen. The Germans reversed that entirely. It was coherent and often devastatingly effective. But it meant the average German soldier was outgunned in individual engagements in a way that doctrine alone could not fix. And the Germans knew it. Their first attempt to close that gap was the Gewehr 41. The army prohibited any gas port drilled into the barrel, forcing engineers into a muzzle trap system that captured gases at the muzzle instead. It was mechanically complex, prone to fouling, and nearly impossible to maintain in the field. The Mauser variant produced roughly 6,700 units, of which over 1,600 were returned as completely unserviceable. Fundamentally flawed from the start, and everyone who used it knew it. The answer came from the enemy. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, their soldiers encountered the SVT-40, a Soviet semi-automatic using a gas port drilled directly into the barrel, exactly what German designers had forbidden themselves from doing. They studied it, abandoned their own restrictions, and built the Gewehr 43 around a similar system, adding a 10-round detachable box magazine. The G43 was genuinely better, lighter, more reliable, faster to produce. It entered production in October 1943 and reached just over 400,000 units by the end of the war. But Germany had wasted 2 years on a failed design and arrived far too late. Their industrial capacity was already at breaking point, producing tanks, artillery, and aircraft. There was simply no room left to retool for mass rifle production. Springfield Armory alone was producing nearly 4,000 M1 rifles per day at peak output. Total Garand production reached 6.25 million rifles. Germany never came close. The M1 got its first battlefield test in the Pacific in 1942. Much of the Marine Corps had initially resisted switching from the Springfield, and Guadalcanal was launched largely with the older rifle. But once Marines used the Garand in actual combat, the resistance disappeared completely. It held up in tropical heat and jungle mud, and produced a volume of fire that neither the Japanese nor anyone else had seen from individual riflemen before. Japanese commanders reported exactly what German commanders would later report in North Africa and Italy, that American units appeared to have far more automatic weapons than their numbers should allow. Banzai charges that had overrun lightly armed positions elsewhere ran into concentrated semi-automatic fire and were stopped before they could close the distance. An American infantryman could put aimed rounds downrange 2 to 3 times faster than a German soldier working a Kar 98K bolt action rifle. That gap compounded across a squad, a platoon, a company, and it changed the fundamental arithmetic of infantry combat entirely. John Garand received the Medal for Merit on March 28, 1944. He received no royalties for the rifle that had armed an entire generation of American soldiers. A bill introduced in Congress to award him $100,000 failed to pass. He retired from Springfield Armory in 1953 on the same modest salary he had always earned, having signed every patent over to the government without compensation. He died in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1974. The rifle he built stayed in American service through Korea and into the early years of Vietnam, eventually replaced by the M14 in 1959. What matters here is what it meant between 1936 and 1945. Every other major military power entered the Second World War issuing bolt-action rifles as their standard infantry arm. Some tried to catch up. None of them got there in time, in sufficient numbers, or with a design reliable enough to matter at scale. The Germans did not fear the M1 Garand because it was unfamiliar. They feared it because it was in the hands of every single American rifleman they faced. It worked every time, and there was nothing in their entire arsenal that could answer it. General George Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. He was not being generous. He was being accurate. If you found this interesting, subscribe. There's a new video waiting for you every single week.